Welcome to today's video on what I call the crash course on interviewing. This video will give students a general overview and outlook on how to prepare for what's called an oral history interview, how to go through and conduct the interview, strategies for conducting it, and also how to conclude the interview and reflect back on it based on the research that you should have already accomplished before starting the interview. Oral history is the academic term for interviewing about historical events and personal experiences related to those events. As a student, you should have already chosen your general topic, and you should have done the initial research by the time that you start to plan out your questions. So what's the first step you ever have to do to take in writing an essay? Well, your first step is to do what you've really already done by this point, and that's choose a topic. So like we've talked about before, your best option is, if you have no idea what you want to write about for this history class, just kind of skim through the syllabus and look at the lecture series and try to pick out something that might interest you, and I would have helped you refine it by now. So by the time you're watching this video, you should have a pretty strong idea of what your topic is, well narrowed down to a topic that is doable for you in the next couple of weeks or months. So now that you have your topic, the next step is to start looking for resources, research sources on your topic. And back in the olden days, when some of us were in college, we used to go into the college book stacks in the college library and literally go find the stack that has the books on our topic, and just start going through the books and looking to see if there's any particular book in there that would be useful for your topic. So like we've talked about before, if you're trying to do research on some battle in World War II, you basically go to the section of the library that has the World War II stuff, and usually they'll have like one shelf that's the military history section that talks about the battles and how one side won and whatnot. So you would basically, take out one of these little chair things on the floor, one of these little stands, and you would sit down in front of that shelf and you'd start looking at the books. And you would want to look at very specific things in one book after another to try to determine which of these books is going to be useful for your essay. So the first thing you want to think about when you pick off one of these books off the shelf, you should look at the table of contents. Because if you're pulling a book of military history for all of World War II off the shelf, but you only want to write about a specific battle, you might look in the table of contents and maybe there's just one chapter that talks about that battle, and the other chapters talk about other battles. So for instance, this image you're seeing here, this is a table of contents for a book about the revolutions within the Spanish Empire in the early 1800s. So that's a gigantic topic, just like all of World War II is a gigantic topic. So if you were doing the history of the revolution in Venezuela, and you're looking at this table of contents, you would go down to number 4 at the bottom, and you see that there's this one chapter on just Venezuela. And you look across, and it starts on page 109, ends on page 123. That's only 14 pages. So that's pretty good. And that also means that this could be a really good book for you to check out because it has a dedicated chapter to your topic. And it also means you probably don't have to read all those other pages before page 109. You might be able to go just right to that chapter and only read that chapter of that book to, get as much information on the revolution in Venezuela as you'll need for just your essay. So the table of contents in these books can be very, very, very useful. If the table of contents is very general or you're not kind of getting much information out of it, another source you can go to is to flip to the back of the book where it usually has a thing called an index. And an index is a list of topics in alphabetical order that tells you where that topic is discussed in the book. So this is the first page of an index from that same Latin American Revolutions book. So if you're interested in a specific battle or a specific leader or general for your topic, you might just look up their name in the index. And like this very first thing in the index, absolutism, you can see there's a whole bunch of different numbers listed next to it. When you're looking at an index and trying to figure out if this is a useful book for you, if I'm researching absolutism in early Latin America, I might check out this book because you can see that there's several sections that the book talks about absolutism for several pages. So there's maybe a lot of good information in there. But if I'm researching absolutism and I don't even see that listed in the index, it means that the book doesn't talk about it. So, put that book back on the shelf. That's not going to be useful for your research. Just like if you're researching a battle or the Venezuelan Revolution, you look in the table of contents and there's nothing on that, maybe this isn't a good book for you to use. If some books don't even have an index. Most scholarly books should, but some don't. And some of the table of contents really aren't really that detailed, so maybe you can't figure out if this is a good book for you to read. The next thing that you might look at doing is go back to the contents page and look at the introduction and maybe read the introduction. You can see in this book on early Latin American history, the revolutions, the introduction is probably only about 6 pages. It starts on page 1, chapter 1 starts on page 7, so the introduction is probably only 6 pages. Not that long. Most introductions in scholarly books aren't that long. Maybe they might go up to 15 or 20 pages. But one thing that introductions very often do in scholarly works, especially toward the end of an introduction, the last few pages, will tell you a chapter by chapter breakdown of what that chapter's about and what the main arguments are. So if you can't kind of glean from the table of contents or the index themselves if this is going to be a good book for you, maybe just read the last part of the introduction, and that might tell you right there in a few paragraphs what the chapters are about, and you might be able to take a good guess whether or not you want to check this book out. So those are 3 things you really want to look at to decide if the book that you're looking at on the shelf is going to be useful for you. Today is a very different kind of day and age for scholarly research. You will often, especially with online-only courses, if you're not physically going to the campus, you might often be working with online databases in the library to access scholarly journal articles or ebooks or something like that, electronic sources. And those can be easy also because you can often download those sources into a PDF right to your computer. And I don't know if you're aware of this, but when you open up a PDF and you can hit Control F on your keyboard and that'll open a dialog box somewhere, a search box, where you can basically do like a Google search. Just type in the name of the battle or whatever your topic is, or the name of the general, or whatever, and just do a term search. And it'll search the whole document. If it's an ebook, it might search the whole book. And all you can do is just look at how many times that term pops up, how many hits you get, basically. And that'll tell you right there if that book or article is going to be useful for you without having to read the whole thing. If you're trying to research a certain battle and you do a term search in the article or the ebook you have, and you only get 1 hit, that means that term only pops up 1 time in all those pages that you've got. So it might not be a very good one for you to use. If you get 10 or 20 or 30 hits or more, that might be a much better article or book for you to use because it talks about your topic a lot. So that's an even quicker way in this kind of electronic day and age to do a real quick kind of analysis of each source to figure out whether or not you want to use it in your research. So, yeah, going back to the library, um, this takes a long time. This takes usually several days all by itself to maybe go through the shelf of books in the library, or to go through your electronic versions. And you usually want to pick out a good 5 to 10 sources to start to read. And that'll take you quite a while, at least several hours all by itself, just to build that list of sources to read. Um, and then you actually have to read them. And if it's a journal article or a book chapter, those are very often 20 or 30 pages. And if you're reading, 5 to 10 of those, one thing you really want to do is take very detailed notes about what you're reading. Because if you're reading, 5 to 10 book chapters or journal articles on generally the same topic, what you'll find is that they talk about pretty much the same events, usually the same people. Each historian who writes a different book has a different interpretation of it, but you want to make sure to take very detailed notes of exactly what you're reading, because after you read a few of them that talk about the same events, what will happen is that it all becomes a kind of soup in your mind, and you'll forget which chapter said what and which historian said what, and that can be very problematic for you, because eventually you're going to have to pull quotes out of this stuff to prove your ideas. So you want to take very detailed notes about what you've been reading, and I can show you this is just one page out of my notes out of a book I read about Andrew Jackson, a U.S. president in the 1800s, and you can see that I write down the details of what is being discussed on these pages, what the main arguments are, in my own words. And if I read a 30-page article or book chapter, I usually end up with a good 5 to 10 pages of single-spaced notes, because there's going to be a lot of ideas in there. And I find it really helps me to write down all its ideas, and you can even see at the end of each little kind of paragraph, there's a page number there. And there's also a letter. It says B7 at the top one. That means that these ideas appear at the bottom of page 7, because I'm so kind of obsessed with efficiency now. If I go back into my notes, I want to find exactly where that discussion is. I don't even want to have to read all of page 7 again. I want to go right to the bottom of it and find it. And the one after that, at the end of that one, it says bottom of page 7 to top of page 8. And you see the next one, middle of page 9, then bottom of page 9, then bottom of 9 to top of 10. So I take very detailed notes to the point where I basically have a map of all the important ideas in my notes by the time I'm done reading that article or book chapter or whatever it is. Because once you read all that stuff and you take that detailed level of notes, really you just start skimming through your notes to figure out what you have to say about this topic and what you've learned, what you think is the most important stuff. But, reading through a good 5 to 10 articles or book chapters and taking this level of detailed notes takes a very long time. So the mass majority of time that you spend in working on this term paper is going to be just basic research, just going through the sources. And that's the same for all historians. We all spend about 90%, 90, of all the work that we put into this thing just in basic research. And yes, that's the answer to number 2. And this is true from you being introductory history students in this course all the way up to the highest levels of scholarship. The people who spend years writing the books that you're going to be reading chapters of, or that you're going to find on the bookshelf in the library. A lot of them, the big books, 700-800 page books or whatever, they take 10 years to write. And very often they'll spend 9 out of those 10 years just in basic research. And then they'll spend 1 year kind of outlining their ideas and writing their draft. So right up to the highest level of scholarship, the professional historians working at the biggest name institutions in the world, the Harvards and Yales and USCs and UCLAs of the world, they're going through the same process. So that's one really important thing to remember as you go through the process. The mass majority of time that you're going to spend on it is just in the basic research, finding the sources, going through the sources, taking notes, and thinking about it. Once you have chosen your topic, collected historical scholarship on it, and taken notes on those readings, you're ready to plan your interview. You can plan this out by creating an interview outline, which I require you to turn in for points. This document requires 3 sections. First, the interview appointment, up here at the top, generally lists the person's name, the place that you plan for the interview to occur, and the day and time that you plan to start the interview with this person. The second section is the interview's purpose, what precisely you hope to learn from the interviewee regarding what you have already learned from the scholarship that you've read, really what you hope the interviewee will contribute to that record. And the third section are the interview questions, really just the list of questions that you plan to ask during the interview. And we will talk in just a bit in much more detail about what kinds of questions you want to ask, in what order, and how you want to plan those out. But I require you to submit an interview outline so that I can review it and suggest any ideas I might have for improving your plan before you actually conduct the interview. Remember that you are not required to interview someone who directly experienced a major historical event like September 11th or a natural disaster or something like that. They don't have to have been directly involved in it to conduct an interview. Your interviewee can be someone who merely witnessed these events or even just lived within the culture that those events unfolded within. So that is enough to learn about this person's personal experiences with the event and compare it to the historical norms that have been mentioned and that you've been researching about in the sources that you should have already read by this point. As you start to think about what questions you want to ask your interviewee, those questions should largely emerge out of the research. When you were researching this event, what questions came into your mind? What kind of questions did historians ask about the popular reaction, or what just kinds of experiences do you want to learn about within that event that you can ask the interviewee that you're starting to line up and put on your calendar for an interview day and time? The first question is always, should be at least, about their own personal background. So when I did several interviews for a dissertation several years ago, my interviewees' experiences were based at a particular community college in the late 1970s and the early 1980s. And so before getting into the details of their experience with those events, I always asked them when and where did they start teaching, because most of these people were teachers working for a community college. What first brought them to the college? And that gets them involved in their personal background, about where they grew up and those types of contexts for their own early life. And that often leads them into specific memories about their early life. And I also tend to ask them, once they arrived at the college, what were their first impressions of the area, of the neighborhood, of the college itself? Well, what did they first think about the area and the culture and the people and whatnot? These are really important questions to ask to start with, because that allows the interviewee to easily slip back into time. And that's what we really want the interviewee to do. And you'll often see this look come over their face where as they start to remember more deeply, they will start to see things in their mind from that time period. And they will stop paying so much close attention to their immediate surroundings in the room that they're doing the interview. And especially the goal is to get them to forget that they're being recorded, so that they're not even aware of the recording devices anymore. And that helps them relax very often. So these types of personal background questions helps them forget their nervousness about being interviewed or being recorded, and helps them develop what we call the deep memory state. state of mind, where they are seeing things in the past in their mind much more than they are seeing things in the room that they are physically in. So that's the kind of thing that we really the place we really want to get them to. And those personal questions often help develop that feeling very, very quickly. Beyond that, the rest of the questions should be grouped according to a shared subtopic, and you see this here. So I've created these different kinds of blocks and whatnot. So there's an event called Proposition 13 that was very important for this college in a certain year. So I asked several questions up front about what was their feeling about the proposition, what did they talk to people about, what did they notice about going on around the college at the time that the voting on the proposition was ready to start, and then after the proposition passed, in my next kind of block of questions, what was their personal response to it, what did they think of it, and what did they think of the college's reaction to the proposition. But these are just specific examples of the interviews I did for that specific place and time as a historical topic. Your event overall should be kind of broadly defined or specifically defined, but you want to ask large, broad questions about what the interviewee experienced. What did they live through? What was their kind of personal story related to different people or different groups that had something to do with that event, or they're witnessing that event, or the places or cultures that they lived within that was connected to the event, or really whatever your research has turned up. And that as you are reading through the research, you should be kind of asking yourself, what kind of questions do you want to ask about this event that you're studying through a particular interviewee's perspective. And again, you might not have to ask this many questions for just an hour-long interview. I mean, this many questions plus even more led to interviews that often went 2 or 3 or 4 hours. So I'm only requiring you to do an interview that's up to 60 minutes, 1 hour. But again, you can see that these are grouped. These questions are grouped within kind of blocks that specifically go through a timeline. Now we're into late 1979 and 1980, talking about different aspects of the college as those months unfolded. But again, you may not have to ask this many questions in your own interview unless you want to go above and beyond the 1 hour time minimum. So that's how you think about building questions, and you really, as part of this module, you will have proposed a bunch of questions, and I will have reviewed them. So by the time you get to the interviewing stage and you're ready to schedule the interview and actually go to the place and conduct the interview, your questions should have been approved in advance. And that leads us to the next section, which is gathering resources for the interview. The biggest resource is to pick a very quiet place, such as possibly the interviewee's home where they feel comfortable. If that is not available, maybe a local library, but usually not in the general area of the library because that can be noisy. But you want to find a library that might have some private study rooms that you could reserve for an hour or two. Or if you don't have that available and you have money instead, you could possibly reserve a hotel room where you interview the person. The key is to find a quiet and calm setting that eliminates distractions. Because if the interviewee starts to slip into that deep memory state, and they are immersed in their memories, the last thing you want is a bunch of doors opening and closing, or people answering cell phones, or laughing out loud, or something like that, because that breaks that memory state and brings them back into the present. And you really want them to slip back into the past in their own memory and stay there for as long as possible, because that's where you're going to get the best information. So a loud or a busy setting really harms the interviewee's concentration and their recollection, and quite honestly can also be very difficult to listen back to and take notes from the recording that you're also getting during the interview. And I can tell you from personal experience, it can be extremely frustrating to listen back to the recording of an interview that was conducted in a restaurant or a hotel lobby or something like this. And just as the interviewee is talking about something that's really crucially important for your research and the questions you're trying to answer in your research, that answers even some mysterious questions that came up when you're doing the research, why did this happen? There seems to be a kind of like a black hole of history, and you're trying to figure out why things happened in a certain way. This interviewee might be able to answer that. And right when they're about to delve into answering specifically that mysterious question that you want to know so much, a dish breaks in the background, or someone walks into a hotel lobby and is laughing real loudly, and that overwhelms the interviewee's statements in the recording, and you just can't hear it. And that's extremely frustrating. So what you want to make sure to do is, again, get a nice quiet room, kind of environment that you can control as much as you can to eliminate distractions. And once the interview starts, and hopefully even before the interview starts, you and the interviewee, make sure you turn off your cell phones, because you do not want that cell phone ringing when they're in the middle of their recollection, their deep memory state. And personally, for me, remember that your interview process will be at least an hour long. That's the actual interview. And I always advise students to try to show up to that place at least a half hour early and set up the room if you can. So you might be looking at up to 2 hours or so for the whole process. So I always found it useful to find a place to eat afterward, or at least a place that has a restroom in the area that you can use, because you're going to be sitting in this room with the person for at least an hour and possibly more, and you do not want to break the interview to use the restroom or something. So once the interview stops, I found very often I had to go use the restroom. So find a restaurant or something that might have a place to eat, or at least a restroom to use immediately after the interview is over. Another thing that you really want to do is to make sure that you have a recording device. You are not going to be able to write down notes of exactly what they say as fast as they say it. And it's really not a good idea to be writing down a whole lot of stuff as they're talking, because that's a great distraction for the interviewee, and it breaks their memory state. So it's much better to have a recording device with you. So either buy a professional recorder, and I even buy a backup, so that in case something with the first recorder fails, you have something that is still recording the session. The worst thing that can happen is that if you only have one, it fails for some reason, and now your interview is stopped and you have to reschedule, which can be difficult depending on your interviewee and their circumstances. So I always have 2 recorders with me, and I make sure that the batteries are fully charged. And if you cannot afford to buy a recorder or two, the college library should have these types of resources available that you can check out for maybe a week at a time or something like that. If you cannot afford to buy them, the last resource possible is if you own a smartphone or a cell phone, there might be a voice recorder setting or app that you can download into your smartphone. That can work also, but the danger of that is that you have to have your cell phone on while you're doing the interview, and you might get a call or something else, and that might break the interviewee's deep memory state. You also want to make sure to verify the appointment with the interviewee a day or two before. Make sure that they remember that it's in their calendar and that you're going to meet at a specific place or time. So call them or contact them somehow, make sure that they remember and that you're not going to show up to an interview that they forgot about. And also make sure that you have the correct address of the interview. If it's a library or hotel room or even their home, map it out. Map out your route to get there well in advance, a day or two before. Plan it out, because you really do not want to get stuck in traffic or something like this, because you do not want to arrive late to the interview. You want to be as professional as possible and give the interviewee as much time and confidence and relaxation as possible, so that they can feel confident that the interview is going well and that there's nothing to worry about on their end. Their job is to show up with their memories and be ready to expand on those memories. So those are the resources and the planning that you really want to put into interviewing. And like I said before, I usually like to arrive at least 30 minutes early to ensure that the room is a good environment. If it's something that I, as the interviewee or the interviewer, control, especially if it's a library room or a hotel room or something like that. Make sure everything is set and it's relaxed, and that you're not going to get any calls. There's not much you can do about that if it's the interviewee's own home. The best you can do is ask them to make sure that they set aside a bedroom or something like that where you can limit noise and distractions and whatnot. So now moving on to strategies for the interview as it goes. The number one strategy is to stay calm and quiet on your end. The interviewers should not disrupt or ask leading questions or interject their own personal ideas or theories or opinions or anything like that. Remember, your job is to let the person tell their story and their experiences. You only want to try to guide them to areas that you, as the researcher, are most interested in. And also, as the interview is going, you want to never worry about the timeline or the chronology of your particular questions. You have your questions in advance, and it's okay to share those questions with the interviewee a few days before so that they can review the questions, and that might kind of get them kick-started on remembering the event and their experiences and whatever else they want to talk about. But as the interview goes and you're conducting it and they're talking, you have to realize that interviewing is more of an art than a science. It requires personality skills, intuition on your part, and recognizing what the interviewee says and how they say it. So their memories will skip around in time. Their memories are not going to follow your pre-planned outline of all these different things that you wanted to talk about or have them talk about. So, for example, you can ask the first few questions and they get going on that. But once you start getting into the details of the event that you want to cover, you probably have your questions lined up according to timeline and chronology of the event and whatnot, but their memories are not going to follow this. So you can ask the first few questions or ask the first question as they start to go. You'll probably realize that their memories will often skip around in time, particularly when memories start to flood back to them. For example, again, these are a bunch of my interview questions. They're listed in timeline order, but I think, 12 or 13 interviews with these questions, and none of them, no interview I ever conducted actually followed the order of these questions. The people's memories about early events immediately their early memories immediately cause other memories to emerge, sometimes regarding later events, and that's fine. Let that happen. Your goal is to keep them immersed in their memory and talking about it as much as possible to get as much detail from them as you can. So if they start to remember things out of order, it's okay. Don't interrupt them. Let that happen. Never stop an interviewee when they're recalling something in the deep memory state. Even if you are not interested in the details that they recall, if they seem to be going off on a tangent, their tangent will probably only last a minute or so. And when they're done telling what they really want to talk about with their story, their little joke or whatever they've got, then you can just quickly move them along to the next topic that you want them to talk about and ask your next question. They might even struggle they might try to put their memories in chronological order. Or they might even, if they have documents or something they've collected, like pictures or, some outline or notes that took from a meeting or something like that, if they have documents in the room with them, they might start kind of thumbing through their documents and trying to figure out when did this happen, when did that happen. You don't want them to do that, because when they do that, it breaks their deep memory state. So if they start to do that, you can just tell them, no, don't worry about that exact chronology or timeline or when this exactly happened. I want you to remember and talk about your experience personally. And you can tell them, I can always go back to the documents later and figure out exactly when these types of things happened with the event. So your goal is to keep them immersed in their memories and in their deep memory state as much and as long as possible, rather than them trying to figure out exactly when things happen and put it into chronology, because that breaks their memory state and brings them back to their kind of rational, logical, timeline type of thinking. Your goal is to keep them immersed in that deep memory state as much as possible. And again, you can always go back and try to figure out the exact timeline or chronology of their memories and statements after the interview when you compare their statements to the research that you collected. The next thing to understand about interviewing is very important. The academics call it hovering. Interviewees will often start to remember details that you might not know about. And they might start to hover or just kind of sit on a certain idea or recollection, and they will want to talk about that in detail. And that's a good thing. You want to let them do that. So if they are hovering over a certain area or a certain subtopic of the event, let them do that, because that's when they tell their personal story and their experience to you. The best case scenario is when they hover over areas that you specifically want to know about and might have to do with the questions that you've built for them to answer. You built those questions because you want to know answers to those questions. So if they can, and if you can get them to do this, keep them hovering over those ideas and those questions for as long as possible in order to gain as much detail and as much information as you can from them about that specific question. But you should also be open to the fact that they might not want to talk about a specific idea or have very little memories about the specific thing that your question is going after. So if that happens, don't try to keep them hovering over such things when their response indicates that they're kind of shutting the door to that idea. They just don't have much information on that. Or if they say that they don't want to talk about it, then there's not much you can do. You just move on to the next question. But this idea of hovering is very important. If you can keep them hovering over the ideas and the questions that you specifically want to know about, that's great. But if not, you can let them hover over other areas that they think is important for you to know as the researcher. The next part is to understand emphasis. Interviewees often give great emphasis, and you can sense this when they're talking. They'll give great emphasis to a certain word or a certain idea. And the academics, the scholars that do this stuff for a living, they say that they call this planting a flag. This is when an interviewee puts specific emphasis on something or other. That means that the interviewee is planting a flag here in the interview, and that is their emphasis on certain words, events, or something like that. When they say that with that kind of gravity on a certain phrase, really pay close attention to that, because they do that because they clearly, that idea or that phrase had a deep meaning for the interviewee at the time, and they've carried that meaning with them in their memory. So you can probe that meaning, and it doesn't have to be regarding any of the questions that you've kind of pre-built for them to answer. If they say something, they plant a flag in something during the interview, ask them, why did they feel that way? Did they change their mind later about that event or topic or whatever? Try to get them to expand on it when they use a certain phrase or a word or idea or something with such gravity. That means that they're trying to open a door for you, and you should encourage them to walk through that door. Give more detail about that. But you can also have to realize that if they plant a flag, if they say something with that type of gravity, you can ask a couple questions about it, but if they don't appear interested in it anymore, then you can just quickly move on if they don't have much more to say about it. That's fine. And you could tell the interviewee, you don't have to answer all these questions very deeply. If you don't have the personal experience with the question, then it's not something that you experience, and so we'll just move on to the next question. That's perfectly fine. No interviewee ever answers every single question. And some questions will bring actively negative body language from the interviewee.
and you will be able to sense the change in emotion in the room. Or it might bring a very short statement that I don't want to talk about that, or I don't know about that, and that you can feel the person's emotion changing. That might mean that you've hit on something very sensitive, or something that they don't want to remember, or it might be a negative memory. But when they express that negativity, you want to get away from that as fast as possible. Go for another question as quickly as possible. Just say, okay, here's my next question, and then you move on. You want them to get away from that negativity, because that negativity is going to inhibit their memory and their willingness to speak about their memory and their experiences. So move out of that zone as quickly as you can and get them back to a more comfortable place where they can go back into the deep memory state. As they're talking, there's also a few other things to be aware of. You want to watch out for people going off on tangents or telling stories or analogies that seem to you very practiced or refined. If it feels to you like a story that they've told many, many times before, that could be an indication that the person is trying to avoid or deflect from a certain topic or question or area. That the question might be very tough for them for some reason. They might not have much of an answer, and so they go back to their kind of stock personal story or joke or whatever they've got to try to avoid it. Or they might be trying to avoid some kind of blame or responsibility for that question. So they're trying to kind of avoid it by taking an alternative route around that question. So when you realize that is happening, you can try to get them to get into more detail about it, but if their response is negative, then again, just move them out of that zone and move to a different place by asking your next question. And quite another thing to be aware of with a lot of interviewees is that they often have a need to be correct about things. And this seems to especially be true about men that I've experienced in my interviews. Men in American culture seem to have this deep-seated need to be correct, to have been the one in authority, to have been the one that told everyone else what's going to happen. So in my interviews, I often found that, especially with men, they would say something like, the company was going to make a certain decision, and I stood up in that meeting. I told them, no, absolutely not. That's going to be an absolute failure. There's no way that's going to work, and it's going to cause great problems for us. But, my jerk bosses ignored me, and so they went ahead and did it anyway, and I was right because that almost destroyed the company. When they say those types of things, that is a very clear need to be correct. That may have actually have happened like that, the way they recall it. But one thing about memory is that we often recall events the way we want to remember them, especially if these events happened decades earlier. So watch out for their need to be right. They will often say that they predicted things or confronted people or something like that in order to feel like they were right about something all along, even if you do some kind of research and find a very different conclusion. So those are the major things to look for in strategizing how to conduct the interview. Once the interview is over, you want to thank the interviewee for their time and their memory, and make sure that you announce when you are stopping the recording and tell them when it has stopped, because that will make them more comfortable. And quite honestly, they often get into the deep memory state so often that they forget that the recorder was even there. So many of the interviews I conducted, they said, oh yeah, I forgot the recorder was even there. And that's a really great sign. But once the recording has stopped, if they said something in the interview, like I'd like to tell you the answer to that, but off the record or something like that, if it's a really official type of interview, you can ask them that certain question or their opinion about whatever question that was once the recorders have stopped, and they know that the recorders have stopped, so it's not something you can quote them on later if they have worries about those ideas or their statements or something like that. That's perfectly fine. But the next step once the interview is over is you thank them for their time and you you leave, and make sure that you have all the resources that you brought in with you, that you take the recorders, that you have them in your possession when you get to your car or wherever transportation you're using. Double check, make sure that you have them, because you do not want to leave one of those behind and have to go back. And if you've checked out a library room, obviously turn in the key and do whatever paperwork is necessary. But really, after the interview is over, your next step is to go back home or to the college or wherever you are, and to compare your research findings that you did before the interview. And the next step is to really compare what the research told you in the books and articles compared to what the interviewee said. And that's going to be the next assignment, the next step in this module. So we'll attack that in the next assignment. The next step is to go back and listen to the interview recording. This will take some time, and you will create an interview timeline as a document that contains the three major pieces that I'll be looking for when grading this interview timeline. And those three major pieces are, number one, the interview's purpose, up here at the top. Number two, the interview timeline, which will give detailed timings within the interview of specific discussions, so that's here. And there's a third part we'll get to in a few minutes called the interview reflection. So when creating one of these documents, I always just list up at the top that it's an oral history timeline. Below that, write the interviewee's name, and then the date the interview was conducted. So you know exactly who and what this timeline connects to. So the first section is pretty straightforward. That is the interview purpose up here. And you should have already written up one of these in your interview outline before you conducted the interview. So this should have already been approved before you even started the interview and recorded it with your interviewee. So largely you can kind of copy and paste that from your interview outline. And for an interview I did several years ago for my dissertation, I interviewed a person who had worked at a certain college, and the purpose of that interview was to learn the details of how the long-term college president, who had been there for decades, was removed from office, and how the process of hiring a new president, and how that new president's policies led to a lot of campus upheaval. So the interview purpose is usually just a sentence or two. Doesn't need to be greatly detailed, just your overall goal for what you want to learn from this interviewee. The next section is the interview timeline. And this is going to be the biggest part of this document that you're creating, the document I call the interview timeline that you're going to turn in for points. So this is going to be the biggest part of what you're going to be turning in. So this right here is an example of a timeline I created for an interview, again, from several years ago. And the purpose for this, the whole real point, is to write down the recorded timing of when your interviewee specifically discussed certain events, memories, experience, or etc. This is crucial because, as we've talked about before, interviewees tend to remember things out of chronological order, and they do that consistently throughout the interview. So your interviewee is not likely to follow every single question that you created in chronological order and answer them all easily and quickly. What you'll find is that their memories for one of your questions will lead to other memories, and will take them off on a side note or a tangent or something, and that can go on for sometimes a minute or two, but they remember other things that are related possibly to your question. So you can see this happening in my timeline I created for this interview, and like always, the first question is personal background. So I asked them where did they grow up, where did they perhaps go to school, go to high school, where did they go to college, what were those experiences like real briefly, and eventually the driving point, I was doing research on this specific college, so I wanted to learn about their experience as an employee at that college within a certain amount of years. So my first question was really driving toward getting their personal background to get them relaxed in the interview, and then how did they get the job at that college? So how did they enter the college as an employee? Because the rest of their experience as an employee is really what I'm focused on in the interview. But you'll notice that my next question would have specifically to do about their role as an employee at the college. But you'll notice that for the first 10 minutes or 5 minutes or so, starting at about 10 seconds when I ask the question, they start talking about their personal background, and then they get to the point where they're finished talking about how they got the job at the college at around 5 minutes 45 seconds. But they don't really stop there. Then they start talking about how much effort it was to set up their family and get a house and get going in the full-time job. So all that took up the next 2 minutes or so, from about 5 minutes 45 seconds to about 7 minutes 35 seconds. And you want to write those types of details in. That there's this other area of discussion that went on for specifically these times. And as you go through and ask your questions and the person talks and remembers these different things and different aspects of things, you want to make sure in your timeline when you go back and listen to this recording later that you group their memories according to shared subtopics. So like their first impressions of wherever they are, that goes on for about a minute, and then they start talking specifically about other things, and you really want to write down the exact minute and seconds that these conversations or these memories begin and end. So your overall goal for this timeline is to create a type of map of the different ideas that the interviewee discussed and where in the recording you can find them. You do not want to, or you don't need to, and you probably don't want to write down a precise word-for-word transcript of every single word that the interviewee spoke, because that would take a lot of time, especially for an hour-long interview. That would take hours and hours to transcribe that much discussion. So instead, you just want to create a general map of the different areas that they talked about, so that if you go back someday and you want to listen back to, if you want to continue your research and do more interviews and compare this person's statements to another person's memories in another interview, then you have a map of exactly what they talked about and when. So if you become specifically interested in this person's work with librarians on campus, and you want to write an essay or something about that, then you know that that conversation happened between 22 minutes 0 seconds and 23 minutes 35 seconds. You don't have to listen to all the other pieces, the whole rest of the hour-long recording. You can just go specifically to those timings and get that conversation. So the interview timeline is really intended as a type of sketch of what was discussed at what time. And it can get pretty detailed. So I had even more subtopics that I listed. So there's all these different ideas that the person talked about. And sometimes like this opinion of the trustees or the board of governors at the time at that specific college, that started at 49 minutes 5 seconds and went for 49 minutes 40 seconds. So he only talked about it for about 35 seconds or so. A lot of these, they can be important, but even if they're important, they might not take up much time in the recording. So I cut off my notes for this to show in this video at about an hour, because I'm only asking students for this assignment, for this module, to do an hour-long interview. This interview with this person actually went for a couple hours, and I had other interviews that went for 3 or 4 hours sometimes. So these interview timelines can grow quite long depending on how long the original interview was. And the third section of this interview timeline document that you're going to turn in for points is known as the interview reflection. And this is also pretty straightforward. You can start by reflecting on what you learned from the historical sources that you researched before you conducted this interview. So ask yourself, and you can write up real quick, what do historians generally think about the event that you chose to study? How do the historians define people's experiences before, during, or after the event? So what are some generalities that you learned from the books and articles that you read about this event in preparing to do this interview? And you want to compare what your interviewee said to the historical record. So is there anything that really surprised you after doing the research? Does the interviewee fill in any gaps that after you did the research, did you have any major questions that you were hoping the interviewee might answer or expand on so that you can increase your historical knowledge? So, for example, this interviewee's memories filled in quite a lot of little gaps in the historical record, because I especially done a lot of local newspaper article reading from the time. So I had spent months reading old newspaper articles about this college in this specific time. And I learned quite a lot from those newspaper articles, but I learned quite a lot more in interviewing people that worked at the college and had daily experience with what was going on internally. So they had like an insider's view of what was going on. So this interviewee specifically filled in a lot of gaps in the historical record that's not in the official newspaper articles and other official records, particularly regarding why the long-term college president was removed from office in a certain moment, and why the college chose to hire a specific person to be the new college president. Another types of questions you can try to answer in this reflection space. Do any of the interviewee statements seem to contrast sharply with the historical research, or do their memories are there any instances where their memories or experiences align with or reinforce the historical scholarship? And in my second piece of the write-up for my reflection about this specific interview, this interviewee expressed many personal opinions regarding a proposition on the ballot that year in California that historians have already talked about and had defined as the general feeling amongst the voting population. So other historians have interviewed other people who had voted in this election and kind of gleaned very similar statements from them that this interviewee expressed. So in this area, the interviewee reinforces a historical record with their statements. In other areas, like this third section down here, the interviewee expressed very strong and important opinions about the differences between what he called the old and the new faculty. So he talked quite at length about what I eventually defined as a faculty generation gap that none of the historical scholarship that I had encountered had ever talked about for this moment and this specific college, but even generally for that era in kind of faculty history. So, and as I took that idea and I asked other interviewees about similar types of ideas about a generation gap, and many of them expressed very similar opinions and memories about the emergence of a faculty generation gap. So I used this in my dissertation as an example of this is a major contribution to the historical scholarship of this era, because the rest of the scholarship had never mentioned much about this faculty generation gap idea. And in my research, I found that at least at this particular college, it was one of the major driving forces for campus unrest and eventually faculty unionization and all these things that happened at that particular college. So I made the argument in my dissertation that this is a giant contribution to the overall historical memory and historical field. So if your interviewee expresses anything like that the rest of the scholarship you had read so far hadn't really gotten to, or had overlooked, or had just not mentioned at all, then you can write that into your interview reflection. But also remember that this section, this reflection, only needs to be a paragraph or two long, a few quick sentences. This is a quick summary for your memory, for your notes. So in the end, you're, again, not trying to write down word for word what the interviewee said. You just write down how does their interview and their memories compare to the overall historical record, and you could do that in just a few different areas and a couple different sentences each. It doesn't have to be extremely extensive. So in the end, this reflection section will tell other historical researchers how and why this particular interview is important for the overall historical record. And this interview timeline document that you're going to send in for points is the final step in this module. So this will be due toward the end of the term for this course. And it is really the culminating document for your entire interview preparation and actual interview conducting experience. And this is like your final write-up for everything that you've done. So this is the culminating document in this module on this entire process that you've been working through the entire term. And this document will help prove your preparation for advanced university level study in history if you decide to try to transfer to a university and continue studying history. So this is the final document of the module. I'm not asking you to write an entire essay based on this interview or the historical record or anything. What you have done in your research and conducting this interview and doing this write-up is equivalent to that type of research and writing. So oral history is often seen as a major aspect of historical research, especially at the university level. And once you have finished this document and sent it in for points, you have achieved at a very high level like many professional historians.